There's a moment in every league's life when the conversation changes. Not because of a scandal, not because of a breaking headline, but because the questions get more serious. That's where the WNBA is right now. Back on November 17th, we talked about the players opting out of the collective bargaining agreement, not as a threat, not as a standoff, but as a signal. A signal that the league wasn't emerging anymore. It was arriving. Since then, nothing has blown up. No strikes, no lockouts, no panic. Instead, something much more important has happened. The league has expanded. The timelines have hardened. The leverage has clarified. And the conversations have quietly moved from possibility to structure. That's the kind of moment most people misunderstand because it's quiet. But quiet doesn't mean inactive. Quiet means the real work is happening. Today, we're not here for drama. We're here for the timeline, the facts, the real issues on the table between the league and its players, and what a realistic, grown-up resolution actually looks like when a league is building for its future instead of reacting to its past. This isn't about picking sides. It's about understanding the process and respecting it. I'm Vincent Cooper, and this is Round Ball Rants. Let's talk about a moment when a league stops asking for permission and starts defining what it's going to be. But before we get into timelines and negotiations, there's something we need to say out loud. Because moments like this, moments where a league is negotiating its future from a position of growth, they don't just happen. They're built. They're built by players who spent years traveling by bus or flying commercial. Not because it was ideal, but because it was what the league needed to survive at the time. By players who played overseas in the off-season because the league couldn't yet sustain them year-round. By players who accepted short rosters, smaller salaries, and limited guarantees because they believed in something that wasn't fully formed yet. The WNBA didn't start with leverage. It started with faith. Faith that the game was good enough. Faith that the audience would grow. Faith that if they held the line long enough, one day these conversations would change. That's why this image matters. Because the players we see at the forefront today, the faces of the modern era, aren't disconnected from the past. They're standing on top of it. Behind them are the builders, the stabilizers, the ones who made it possible for this league to reach a moment where growth is assumed, not argued. This CBA negotiation isn't about catching up anymore. It's about honoring what's already been paid for by deciding how that progress gets protected. Now, with that context in mind, let's walk the timeline from November 17 until now. On November 17th, here on Round Ball Rants, we talked about the players opting out of the current collective bargaining agreement. And at the time, that conversation lived almost entirely in the future tense. What could change? What might be impacted? What this opt-out signaled? Now, as we approach January, it's time to come back to that moment and walk through what's actually happening since, because the biggest update isn't one headline. It's the timeline. When we talked about this on November 17th, the WNBA Players Association had already formally exercised its opt-out clause. The existing CBA was set to expire after the 2025 season, and both sides agreed to continue operating under the current rules, while negotiations moved forward behind closed doors. There was no public deadline, no strike threat, no lockout language, just an understanding that early 2026 would be the pressure window. At that moment, negotiations were still conceptual. Growth was real, but leverage still lived mostly on paper. The question we asked then was simple. What happens when this moves from theory to timing? In the weeks immediately after that episode, something important happened. Absolutely nothing. no escalation, no public back and forth, no counter statements from the league, and that silence matters. Because in labor negotiations, silence usually means the process is working the way both sides want it to. Internal conversations were active. Positions were being clarified, and nobody believed negotiating in public would help them. The opt-out wasn't being used as pressure. It was being used as positioning. As December arrived, the context around these negotiations began to shift, not because of labor news, but because of expansion. Expansion stopped being theoretical. The league has now officially awarded multiple new franchises with defined timelines. The Golden State Valkyries were set to debut in 2025, which they did. The Toronto Tempo will begin play in 2026. A Portland WNBA team is also slated for 2026. And the Cleveland Rockers are officially returning in 2028. As well as a Philadelphia WNBA team is targeted for 2030. That's 5 expansion teams over a 5-year span. That's not growth. That's re-engineering the league. And expansion changes everything. Because every new team raises questions that only the CBA can answer. More teams mean more roster spots, more guaranteed contracts, also more travel, more physical load on players, and more competition for talent. Suddenly, things that didn't need answers in November demand answers in December. Roster size, salary floors, player protections, travel standards, benefits alignment. You cannot responsibly expand into markets like Golden State, Toronto, Portland, Cleveland, and Philadelphia, all basketball-savvy, high-expectation cities, without reinforcing the labor structure underneath them. Expansion exposes the frame. By mid-December, another shift became undeniable. Nobody serious was questioning whether the league was growing anymore. Attendance held, visibility held, momentum held. And when growth is assumed instead of debated, negotiations change. The players weren't arguing potential anymore. They were asserting participation. That's a different posture than even a year ago. Then quietly but meaningfully, player optionality entered this conversation. Not through confrontation, but through proof. The visibility of off-season alternatives like Unrivaled didn't challenge the league's legitimacy. It demonstrated player value. Players showed that they can draw audiences independently, sustain fan engagement year-round, and create viable basketball products outside of the single structure. That doesn't weaken the WNBA. It strengthens the player's voice within it. And even if that's never said out loud at the negotiating table, it's understood. So now here we are. No lockout talk, no strike threats, no emergency meetings leaked to the public, but also no backtracking, no softening of priorities, no slowing of expansion ambitions. January isn't a deadline you circle on a calendar. It's a turning point in posture. This is when language starts getting drafted. Frameworks stop being flexible, and long-term decisions take shape. If November was about impact, December was about clarity, and January is about definition. From November 17 until now, this story hasn't stalled. It's matured. The stakes are clearer. The leverage is firmer. And the conversations are no longer abstract. This isn't delay. This is preparation. And this is exactly what a growing league looks like before it defines its next era. So now that we've tracked what's changed since November, the next question is unavoidable. What does each side actually want? And where does January force those priorities into focus? Now that we've walked the timeline from November 17 until now, the natural question becomes this: What are these negotiations actually about? Not what people think they're about, not what social media reduces them to, but the real documented issues sitting between the WNBA and the WNBPA. And the important thing to understand here is this: none of these issues are new. They've all been living inside the current system. What's changed is that they can't be delayed anymore. Let's start with revenue, because that's the foundation everything else sits on. Under the current CBA, collective bargaining agreement, players receive a defined share of league revenue that was negotiated at a very different moment in the league's history. At the time, media rights were smaller, sponsorship reach was more limited, and the league's growth curve was still uncertain. That's not an insult to the past, it's context. Since then, the league has expanded its broadcast footprint, increased attendance, brought in new sponsors, and committed to long-term growth through expansion. So when players talk about revenue share now, they're not asking for a philosophical shift. They're asking a practical question. If the league's revenue profile has changed, should the revenue split remain locked to an earlier version of the league? That's not emotional leverage. That's structural logic. Next is salary structure. And this is one of the most misunderstood parts of the conversation. The WNBA operates under a hard salary cap. There's no luxury tax buffers. There's no flexibility band. When teams hit the cap, decisions get ruthless. Every season, we see talented, productive players waived, not because they can't play, but because the math doesn't work. That's not a future problem. It's a present one. And as expansion adds teams and increases demand for talent, that pressure doesn't go away, it intensifies. So when players raise concern about salary floors, mid-tier contracts, and cap structure, they're not challenging the idea of a cap. They're questioning whether the current version reflects the league's current scale and expectations. Then there's roster size and job security. And this is one of the most concrete issues on the table. Right now, roster limits are tight. Guaranteed contracts are limited. Injury replacements can put players in precarious positions. This isn't theoretical. It's why you see players cycle in and out of lineups even after earning their spot. Expansions magnifies this. 5 new teams create opportunity, but only if roster rules evolve alongside them. Otherwise, expansion just increases competition without increasing stability. More teams without adjusting the labor structure means more short-term contracts, more uncertainty, and more pressure on players to accept risk. That's not sustainable in a league asking players to commit more than ever. Travel and workload is another area where facts matter. The league has made real documented progress here, especially with improved charter flight access. That deserves acknowledgement. But expansion changes the equation. More teams means more miles. International markets add logistical complexity. Compressed schedules increase physical strain. So the issue isn't whether the league has improved travel, it's whether current standards scale responsibly as the league's footprint grows. That's a legitimate, forward-thinking concern, not a complaint. Then there's prioritization, and this one has been public for years. The league's prioritization rules were created to protect continuity, competitive balance, and product consistency. That's the league's interest, but players have consistently raised concerns about limited off-season flexibility, conflicts with overseas opportunities, and financial trade-offs created by strict enforcement. This isn't a new fight, it's an unresolved one. And any long-term CBA revision has to decide whether the balance between league control and player autonomy still fits where the league is today. Now here's where balance matters. The league isn't ignoring these issues. It's balancing sustainability, expansion costs, ownership investment, and long-term visibility. The league's concern isn't growth, it's growing too fast without support underneath it, and that's a real concern. But the players aren't pushing chaos either. They're pushing for alignment, for labor structures that match the demands, visibility, and responsibility the league now places on them. That's the tension. Not league versus players, but growth versus structures catching up. And this is why January matters. Not because it enforces drama, not because it creates deadlines, but because it removes the option to keep postponing decisions that expansion, revenue growth, and visibility have already made unavoidable. None of these issues appeared overnight. They've been waiting their turn. January is when that turn arrives. So, if segment 1 showed us how we got here, and segment 2 shows us what's actually on the table, then segment 3 is about the hardest question of all. What does a fair, realistic deal actually look like for a league that's still growing, but no longer emerging? Before we move into the final part of today's conversation, I want to take a moment to thank our partner, W. One of the things I respect most about W is that it's built for focus, not spikes. No sugar crashes, no artificial overload. Just clean energy that helps you stay present. Whether you're grinding through work, locked into a creative process, or just trying to get through a long day without burning out. And that matters, especially in moments like this, where patience and clarity actually count. If you've been meaning to try W, this is a great time to do it. Head over to w.gg and use our code Round Ball Rants at checkout to save on your order. That's w.gg, promo code Round Ball Rants. Alright, let's get back to it. So now that we've tracked how we got here, and we've laid out what's actually on the table, the last question becomes the hardest one. What does a realistic resolution look like? Not a perfect one, not a wish list outcome, but a deal that both the WNBA and the WNBPA can live with and build on. And the first thing that has to be said here is this. This negotiation is not about flipping a switch. It's about phasing into the league the WNBA is becoming, not pretending it's already finished evolving. A realistic resolution almost certainly starts with incremental movement, not swapping overhaul. On revenue, that likely means adjusted revenue sharing mechanisms, new benchmarks tied to growth milestones and upside participation that increases as league revenue increases. Not an overnight transformation, but a structure that no longer treats growth as hypothetical. And that matters because it aligns player compensation with league success without overcommitting ahead of sustainability. That's a compromise that both sides understand. On salary structure, realism probably looks like gradual increases to salary floors, better protection for mid-tier contracts, and more flexibility as expansion adds demand for talent. Not the removal of cap, but modernization of how it functions in a league that's bigger, more visible, and more competitive than it was when the current rules were written. That's not radical, that's maintenance. Roster size and job security are similar. A realistic outcome likely includes slight roster expansion, increased use of guaranteed contracts, and clearer protections around injury replacements. Not because players are asking for comfort, but because expansion without stability creates churn. And churn is bad for players and the product. Continuity matters when you're trying to build fan attachment in new markets. Travel and workload is an area where compromise is already visible. The league has shown willingness to improve the standards. A realistic resolution probably builds on that, codifying travel improvements, scaling recovery standards with expansion, and acknowledging that a geographically larger league requires different protections than a smaller one. That's not a concession. That's operational maturity. Prioritization is the trickiest piece, and it's where realism matters the most. The league wants continuity. The players want autonomy. A realistic solution doesn't eliminate prioritization, it refines it. That could mean more flexible reporting windows, adjusted penalties, or clearer off-season pathways that don't force financial sacrifice. Not a free-for-all, but not a choke point either. Now, here's the most important part of all of this. A realistic resolution doesn't end tension, it manages it. Because this league is still growing. Expansion isn't done. Media deals will evolve. Revenue will fluctuate. So the smartest deal isn't the one that solves everything forever. It's one that builds in revenue mechanisms, allows recalibration, and assumes change instead of fearing it. That's how you future-proof a CBA in a modern sports league. And that's why January matters. Because not in the way people think. January isn't about forcing agreement, it's about establishing direction. It's about deciding, are we building a framework that can grow, or are we locking ourselves into language that will need fixing again immediately? Both sides know the answer to that question matters more than any headline. This negotiation doesn't need a villain. It needs patience. It needs precision. And it needs both sides to acknowledge the same truth. The WNBA isn't emerging anymore. It's arriving. And arrival demands structure that matches ambition. And when leagues arrive at moments like this, moments where growth meets responsibility, the best thing that they can do, it isn't rush, it's listen. Let's take a breath for a second, because after all the timelines, after all the negotiations, after the structure and the language and pressure points, the story is still about people. Players trying to build careers that last. A league trying to grow without breaking what makes it special. Fans trying to understand what patience actually looks like in real time. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Growth seasons don't feel exciting while you're inside of them. They feel quiet. They feel unresolved. They feel like waiting. We're conditioned to think progress shows up as announcements, as wins, as losses, as clean endings. But real progress, it usually shows up as listening, remeasuring, and not rushing to be right. That's what this moment is for the WNBA. Not panic, not celebration. Just adults in a room trying to build something that can last longer than a news cycle. And that's something a lot of us can relate to. Because most of us aren't living in highlight reels either. We're living in the in-between. The planning stages. The not there yet, but not where we started. Moments. Those moments don't feel heroic. They feel heavy. But they're also where the foundation gets set. So if this episode felt slower, if it felt quieter, that's intentional. Because sometimes the most important thing that you can do in sports, in work, or in life is not rush the process just to feel finished. Sometimes the work is sitting with it and trusting that growth, done right, speaks for itself. I'm Vincent Cooper. This was Round Ball Rants. Thank you for staying with me through the process today. And remember, it's not just basketball. It's therapy with a bounce.